channel. Now, today marks 100 years since the news got around Cork that Michael Collins had died the previous day. Because, of course, 22nd of August, he was driving back from a tour of West Cork when he was ambushed at Belle de Blois. They could have driven through it, but he said, no, 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 we'll fight them. He got out, he opened fire, he was shot dead almost immediately. The only one killed in that incident, two of his men were wounded. So anyway, I mean, obviously he was definitely on the right side of the Civil War. He was on the wrong side in the Troubles. But this incident where he got killed says much about the man. There it was, foolhardy. They weren't going to come out better of that situation. They could have just driven through it and taken no casualties. They didn't inflict any casualties on the IRA as it was. So that was poor leadership, bad decision from him. Got himself killed. Was it gallant? I mean, I don't think so. And the other thing is, he'd also been drinking on duty in uniform, a general, only hours earlier. And that delay had allowed the IRA to set up the ambush because they saw it was in the area. Had he not stopped at his cousin's pub for a while and just come straight back to Cork, there would have been no ambush. But anyway, some of my viewers might not know much about him. So he's born Sam's Cross near Clonakilty in 1890 into a family of Catholic smallholders. I'll speed through it. You know, his father's much older than his mother. His father died when Michael Collins was little. His father been in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So Michael Collins was in the post office, worked in London, was a stockbroker in the IRA in the 1916 Rising, and so on. Out of there, he was interned in Frongoch, released after only a few months by the incredible clemency of the government, because of course the British are renowned for their mercy. I mean, truly, got to be one of the most compassionate country in the world at that time. Which other country in the midst of a world war would release insurgents after only 8 months, having executed just a handful of them? You know, only about 2% of those involved in the Easter Rising were put to death. Anyway, so there he was out, and then major figure in Sinn Féin, elected to the UK Parliament in December 1918, and for South Armagh, which is obviously the most hardcore Republican area in recent times. So that was him, and said we're going to fight this differently and have an insurgency, not fight pitched battles. IRA's director of intelligence and so on, director of finance, had a great head for figures. So some people see him as enigmatic, a big fellow. He liked a bit of rough and tumble. Was he a bully? And said he didn't care about ethics, he simply wanted to win. But even amongst the IRA, he was notorious for his mercilessness. And anyway, in 1918, went over to negotiate a treaty in London, and so the major portion of Ireland left the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland remained within the UK, and so on, various other terms. And he'd been really obdurate, but he agreed to take an oath to our sovereign lord, King George V, who had the title King of Ireland. And the Parliament of Southern Ireland was set up, and so on. So as a minister in that, he was chairman of the Executive Council of the Provisional Government, as effectively Taoiseach, or Prime Minister. So yeah, he died during the Civil War, and that was it. But I have a very poor opinion of him. I think he's really overrated. And then obviously don't like him causing this conflict in Ireland in 1916. He wasn't that high up in the IRA at that time, and continued the conflict in 1919. He ought to have been grateful for the enormous mercy he'd been shown, the magnanimity of not only not being executed, which he could have lawfully been done, but of being released after only 8 months. And others have said, well, we'll try peaceful protest, but no, he was going to use force. So yeah, I mean, the Republicans in the First World War, they pretended they want Ireland to be neutral, but that's very dishonest because they incited a German invasion of Ireland, which didn't actually materialize. Anyway, he wanted a 32-county republic, which had never existed and may never exist, and he betrayed that republic he'd taken an oath to as part of the Fenians, and so on. Because, of course, he took an oath to George V. So, and there's all this nonsense about, oh, well, had he lived, it would have been different. The Civil War wouldn't have been so bad. Well, as I say, he was known for his ruthlessness. So after he died, the Free State Army executed IRA prisoners, about 77 of them. There's no reason to doubt that he would have authorized that. He was also a man who was notorious for his double dealing, and during the truce between the IRA and the Crown forces, authorizing some attacks in Northern Ireland, getting into sectarian conflict, murdering Protestant civilians because loyalist terrorist organizations, the Ulster Protestant Association, was murdering Catholic civilians. Now, sectarian violence is, of course, despicable. And that's just as bad for the IRA engages as when the UPA engaged in it. And the murder of one of the most distinguished Irishmen of the age, Sir Henry Wilson, and two of Collins's men, Reggie Dunn and who's the other bloke, Sir Sullivan, were executed for that. Anyway, so he had no compunction about killing unarmed people, and including civilians. Anyway, so his premature death might even be regarded as welcome. I mean, had he lived, I don't see how things would have been much better. He admired Denmark. I read some of the articles he wrote and saw Denmark as a model for Ireland because it's roughly the same land area and population as us, a largely agricultural country. Um, Anyway, and then he had this huge funeral, and people exalted him, even his former foes. They held him in high regard, and there were reports that Mountjoy prison where the IRA were interned. When they heard that Collins had been slain, they fell to their knees and said decades the rosary. So his body was brought to Shankill Hospital in Cork just after he was killed because of various IRA sabotage attacks that had to take a circuitous route. He was killed shortly before, sundown on the 22nd of August, but they didn't reach Cork till the wee hours. And then the news became generally known about Cork. So he's had a huge public funeral in Dublin. He's interred at Glasnevin Cemetery in a fairly simple grave. I've been there, stood within 6 foot of the man who was at least 6 foot long himself. So he never wed. He was 32. There's even some speculation about his sexuality. And people say who somehow would have resolved the Northern Ireland situation. So a bit of a JFK figure. Oh, if only he'd lived, as though he could have worked wonders. No, well, I don't think he would have been able to effect miracles. But anyway, people who took his side in the Civil War, they found Cumla Gael, which is now Fine Gael, which is one of the two major parties. And obviously, there's been a duopoly. The government has alternated between coalitions based around Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And for the first ever time yesterday, well, on Sunday actually, at Belknap the mouth of the flowers, it was not just the leader of Fine Gael, who's the Taoiseach, Dr. Leo Varadkar, but also the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, who's a Cork man himself, who gave the oration and addressed them, because they're in coalition for the very first time. So Collins, I think he's rather overrated. I mean, he was fairly effective in the IRA at killing informers for the Crown. But I don't think he was a wonderful political leader. I certainly disagree with him quite strongly. And I've been to that Belknap ceremony as well, where he met his doom. So perhaps it's poetic justice that he met the fate he devised for so many others to be shot dead by the IRA. I mean, not that I would want him to be killed, because I think, yes, he was doing the right thing. Okay, and a treaty had been signed. That should be into effect. Doyle Aaron, every single one of whom was a Sinn Féiner, had ratified it. The people of Ireland had voted yes for about 80%. So of course it should be given effect. And also some reasonable people and trades unionists and former unionists in there. Thanks for watching my channel. So make sure you subscribe on Patreon, look at my website, George from Ireland, so on, follow me on social media. And thank you for donating on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Toodaloo.